Just going to start recording. Hello and welcome to Show and Tell with the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning at Lancaster University. Do please note the session is being recorded and it'll be subsequently hosted on the CTEL YouTube channel. We would ask, if you don't mind, that you leave your cameras on. Of course, if you're okay with potentially appearing on the recording, but if you don't feel comfortable with your camera on, then equally feel free to leave it off too. It's just nice sometimes to present to faces. We do have modest numbers who come to these live recorded workshops. We tend to get around 6 to 12 times that number who'll catch up later on YouTube. But you know, sometimes it is nice for the presenters to have a few friendly faces to speak to in the recorded delivery. So thanks for those who've managed to come along today. Show and Tell is a recorded series of workshops with a specific focus on capacity building for doctoral researchers and early career researchers in TEL. You can see previous episodes on the Centre YouTube channel, so please do visit, subscribe if you haven't already. You can see a few previous episodes there on things like theory, peer review, time management, critical writing, trustworthiness, things like that. This episode is on generative AI with one of our incredibly supportive and active CTEL members, Rob Miles, who for me epitomises how all research centres thrive on the will and activity of their members. While Rob gets going, I'm just going to ask if we can all please just maybe type a quick comment into the chat to say hello and where we are in the world. If you've got any questions for Rob, you can wait and ask him yourself when we have some Q&A time later. Or alternatively, you can type a question into the chat box there and I'll pick them up later and ask on our behalf. Do feel free to add comments too. You don't just have to ask questions. They might just be, supportive remarks, signposts, bits of information we've picked up. And I'll put any relevant links into the YouTube description for colleagues who are catching up a bit later on. So thanks very much. Rob, if you want to just check you're okay sharing.
Okay, I'm okay to share. Yeah, it looks like it. So, how's that?
That's super, that. Thanks, Rob. Best wishes.
Okay. So I think I'll get cracking. If you hear any loud bangs in the background, we're in the middle of a very major thunderstorm here in the UAE. So hopefully my power won't cut out. But as I say, don't be alarmed by any loud bangs or flashes. It's just the weather. So I'm Rob Miles. I'm currently a lecturer in education, but my main background is in English teaching. So I should warn you already that lots of the examples I use tend to be from English language classrooms, but hopefully they'll cross over into other areas as well. Currently, as I say, I'm teaching education courses, a lot of teacher training. I'm an alumni member of the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning. I also do a bit of policy writing for the UAE Ministry of Education around technology, and more recently around AI, particularly generative AI. So I usually start this off with what is generative AI, and we all think we know, so I just sort of copied out the Wikipedia part of it. Now, I mean, some people criticize me for using sort of anthropomorphized images during these presentations, but I think that's how a lot of us do think about AI, that we tend to sort of personalize it to make it anthropomorphic. I know my brother, who uses it a lot for computer programming, he always says thank you. And he says that he hopes that it remembers when the singularity occurs, and it will be nice to him because of that. But basically, it's taking large models and it's training systems to give human-like responses. Not necessarily human responses, but human-like. They're in the imagination, of course. You'll notice there some of the from movies. I mean, these are all perhaps common sort of AI images we might think of from movies. I mean, we've got the Terminator, there's Ex Machina, which is in the bottom right, obviously HAL from 2001, and then a replicant from Blade Runner. These all have one thing in common, in that they're trying to kill us. And that's very much what some people are afraid of with AI. On the other side of that, you've then got the sort of more benevolent type of AI. Think of your Siri and your Alexa, the sort of willing servant that's happy to help you, slightly comical or tragic, you know, like sort of Wall-E and those droids from Star Wars. And of course, if you probably don't recognize the other one, but that's from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is Marvin the paranoid android. I think the reality is ideally is somewhere in between. We need to be wary of AI, but we also need to be aware of its capacities and not necessarily turn our back on those dangers or the risks with it, and at the same time not embrace it, not turn it away rather than not embrace it. There's been a lot of negative press coming out from the great and the good and the otherwise. I mean, Elon Musk, for example, he thinks something terrible might happen within 5 years. Other people worrying that we understand it. We think we understand it when we don't. And other people are concerned about natural stupidity rather than artificial intelligence, all worthy things to worry about. And then again, we've got the positive. As Bill Gates said, AI can be our friend. This Andrew guy from Coursera, of course, the great MOOC company, he thinks it's worrying about it. It's a bit like worrying about overpopulation on Mars. I mean, is it something we really should be concerned about? And I quite like the last one here from the Microsoft chairman about, you know, what AI can't replace is those human qualities, which is the creativity, the empathy, and the judgment. And perhaps we should be using it to amplify that. And that's, I think, kind of where I would position myself, somewhere in the middle there. So what's been happening around the world with it? Well, in the United States, it's taken very much a sort of free market approach, a very frontier mentality, in fact, in that anything goes, do what you like, these AI companies. It doesn't matter. Progress is progress. And it's obviously that in itself leads to issues. Other countries, perhaps there on the right of the screen, have taken a very restrictive approach to AI in their own countries. But that's then stifles innovation and stifles creativity. Again, in the middle of that, you've had the sort of European approach to it, which is, again, to balance between that, the powers of the free market against restrictive government policies, and to try and get some balance in the middle. And what they particularly, if you look at any of the EU policies that are coming out, the important thing they keep mentioning is keeping it human-centric, keeping the human involved at all stages whenever you're using AI. It's, you know, to keep us at the center of it, our interests and our input. Now, institutional responses are equally varied. I know some institutions are perhaps embracing it. I don't know of that many. I know other institutions that are just putting their head in the sand and not responding to it, sort of refusing to deal with it. And others are banning it. They're approaching it as a sort of academic integrity issue. And they're saying, you know, this student has used AI. That's an academic dishonesty offence. They're going to get a 0. They're going to fail that course. They're going to have to sit in front of a committee of angry professors and explain why they did that and why we shouldn't kick them out. But it's too late. Cheesy image, I know, that the genie is out of the bottle. You know, we need to sort of face up to this. And I think, you know, this sort of Luddite banning of it and the sort of utopian acceptance of it, we need to be somewhere in the middle. And this is where I think we should be taking a sort of triple approach to it. So we need to be thinking about AI literacy, AI integrity, and AI ethics. And that sort of triple approach needs to be integrated and kept with the human at the center of it. Okay, so the literacy, the integrity, the ethics, with humans at the center of it, I think is, in my opinion, is the way forward with how we approach AI, not just in higher education, but I think in our lives in general. So let's go into a bit more detail about how I've seen it being used. Now, before we started, Phil and I were chatting, and he said about something that's quite nice. I'm going to repeat now, Phil, if you don't mind, about sunlight being the best disinfectant, and getting things out in the open about what teachers are doing. And my own research, these are some of the things that I've been able to find amongst English language teachers locally and a bit further afield through a couple of courses I've done, tend to be using it for these types of things. A lot of it is time saving. We're all very busy, and you can go straight onto a well-known website such as ChatGPT, and very quickly you can brainstorm ideas for discussion. If you're a language teacher, for example, you could be generating closed tests for language development around vocabulary and grammar. You could be generating topics for writing essays. You can use it for generating model essays, good and bad examples. You could be generating reading passages. If you're really snowed under, you can even be generating full lesson plans, to save yourself time. But this is where teacher input is key, and where I've found, people report having fallen down. That they've had a busy weekend. They've been to brunch on Saturday. They've spent Sunday on the beach recovering, and then Monday morning they're walking into class and they realise, oops, didn't do any prep. I better get something done quickly. So you put a prompt into ChatGPT, for example, and so you give me 150-word reading passages about Dubai with 5 comprehension questions. And it throws out a little text for you, 5 questions. You think, fantastic, that's the next hour sorted. However, with the type of students I'm teaching, if I didn't apply my own experience and knowledge of the students to this lesson would go on and be a bit of a disaster, because when I looked at it, this won't mean much to non-language speakers, but basically my students here in the UAE are at a B1 CFR level. That's about, they can just about have a chat, but they're not particularly fluent. B2 and C1 and C2 is well above their level. Words that don't have a colour, that are still in the sort of original black, these are words that are off list. So these are words they're not going to come across. Obviously, some of those words like Dubai, Burj Khalifa, they're very specific. But quite a lot of this language is well above the level of my students. And this is a mistake some teachers are making. They're just, copying and pasting stuff that they've got off ChatGPT without using their experience, their own pedagogical knowledge, their own knowledge of the students to adapt that material. So this is where the human is at the center of that. I can now look at that and I realize I have to adapt this text for the level of my students. Otherwise, what I thought was going to be a nice peaceful hour is going to be, I don't know, lots of 10 minutes of students looking at it in a confused fashion, followed by the next 20 minutes of them playing on their phones, and because they can't be bothered to answer it because they don't understand it. Another use I've seen people doing is writing comments. So what you can do is you can write sort of generic comments. There's an original on the side, demonstrates correct grammar in simple sentences, but commits some mistakes in complex sentences. Demonstrates overall blah, 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 okay? You can then get generative AI to give you varieties of the same comment, which I've given you 4 examples there. You can then use something fancy like a mail merge, and very quickly you can populate student reports, and you can, give, on the surface of it, looks like individualized comments to students without you actually having to write more than 1 comment, for example, for each particular level. And I mean, my question with that is that okay? If you're a parent, would you be okay if your kid's school report is being largely generated by AI? Is that all right? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how I'd feel about that. I know this is something I've done myself. Last semester, I had to generate 60 reports for a group of students, and I rejigged the comments using generative AI, and then I used mail merge to fill in forms and send it out. It was very, very effective. Was it ethical? Was I open about it? No, I wasn't. But it was definitely a time saver. This sort of also leads into something else people are doing, which is getting feedback on essays. Now, I know at the moment I'm getting towards the end of the semester here, and I have a phenomenal amount of marking to get through. I'm sure it will be the same with a lot of you here. I know, for example, my tutors in Lancaster will have had to wade through lots of modules, and my supervisor when I was doing my PhD getting bombarded with my chapters. And what I expected was their feedback. Now, it's very easy. You can put a prompt in. And what I've done here is I've used a prompt that asked it to give IELTS-style feedback on this essay. And I haven't even read the essay, but it'll give me some very professional-looking feedback. And I think a student would be very pleased to receive this. However, would the student be okay about it when they realise that I didn't write any of that? When my class of 30 students have all had, very comprehensive feedback, and my boss looks at that and says, "Oh, Rob, you must be putting some hours in." And I'm like, "Yeah, that took me about 15 minutes. Really? I mean, is that okay?" These are the questions I think we have to ask. So this is where the triple approach comes back into it. Do we know how to use it? Okay. That's the literacy. Are we being open regarding how we do it? So is it okay, for example, to use it for feedback, to use it for generating report comments and things? But then we need to be open about that. It needs to be clear that, like when you get through to the bank and you're on the chat bot, you're talking to a bot. That this feedback is coming from generative AI. I think we need to be open. And then are we keeping human ethics at the center of that? Are any of these things perhaps problematic? Are we, as soon as we've put information about a student into OpenAI, it's gone. That information is now out there. It's part of their database of knowledge. The essay that I spent hours writing and then I've uploaded and asked for feedback on within ChatGPT, that all of that information now is theirs. It's gone. I no longer have control of it. So these are things we need to be very careful about, things we need to be thinking about. So what about students? Well, I know what the big concern is, and a lot of it's around assessment. And I think what we really need to do is reassess how we assess. Now, I've got a thing here. As an activity theorist, I like triangles, but this particular triangle is called a fraud triangle. It's by the Albrechts from 2008. And this relates to basically how an individual will justify fraud. So in this case, it would be how an individual might justify using ChatGPT to answer their exam questions or to write the essay for their teacher. What we do is, with sort of summative assessment, we create a lot of pressure. I know, students who are studying in the UK, they're getting themselves very much into debt, or their parents very much into debt, paying university fees. When you're studying at, master's and PhD level, maybe, there's a lot of pressure on yourself to get through these things. You're perhaps footing the bill. Maybe your institution is footing the bill. They're not going to be happy if they have to pay an extra year because you didn't pass. Now then, if I'm giving them a traditional essay type question, the opportunity is now there. You can pump that into ChatGPT, and it's going to give you an answer to the question. And because of the pressure, because of the opportunity, this leads to rationalization. Students will say to themselves, it's okay for me to do this, because maybe I think everybody is doing it. Maybe they must know that I can just pump this into a website and it's going to give me an individual sounding answer. They don't realize the pressure I'm under. They don't know how much money this is costing me. I have to pass this. It's really important. I have people relying on me. So all of this rationalization, we're creating a fraud triangle if we don't reassess how we assess. So I think, for example, we need to be thinking about new processes. And one thing I've been thinking about is, someone said to me, said, oh, ChatGPT, that's it. It's the death of the essay. The essay is done. Halas, finished. I'm not sure it is, but I just think we need to change how we process this. And it's something I've been sort of experimenting a bit with some of my students, is let's brainstorm our ideas for that essay. And we can ask generative AI to help us with that process. But let's be open about it. And then let's record that and say, okay, stage 1 brainstorming. Here's what we've got. Here's the prompts we used. Give us ideas on this process, blah, 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 blah. Then, we ask students to try to write something and write it themselves, knowing that they're going to be allowed to use generative AI later. But let me see what you can come up with by yourself at this stage. Then you can ask the AI for feedback, to fix it, to correct it, to give you some more ideas. Then you can revise it, and then you submit all stages. So, for example, in my own classroom at the moment, I've got a group of early years teachers, trainee teachers, and they've had to write a kids' book for the ages of 5 to 7. Now, I've asked them to submit their original story, their draft, if you will, in addition to their revised version, which they've all put through ChatGPT. So I can see what is theirs and what's a revised version. And then what I'm actually getting in the end is something that's very professional and very successful, something that's perhaps a story they could take into a classroom and use, and parents would be happy with, because it's, if not quite professional, at least it's at a very high level, rather than perhaps something that linguistically they would struggle to produce. But seeing all those stages, we're open about it. I know that you're using it. Show me what you've done. Show me what you did originally. Show me what you've then produced. And let's look at that final product as in relation to that. Is that okay? I think it is. Okay, I'm open to argument, but I don't see a problem with that. So I think we need to reflect and also refocus on the process. At the moment, we're very much concerned with the outcome and not enough about the process of how we're assessing our students. So we need to think, what do we really need to assess? We've got at the moment, again, that very sort of traditional focus, which is, where is it? Sorry, this one here, my slides have gone a bit out of order. We've got this traditional focus where we're looking at the outcome, we're looking at that final essay, and then we're saying to the student, this isn't your work. You've used AI to help you generate this. I know you can't write this well. I know that your grammar isn't that good. You don't have that kind of vocabulary. So instead, we should be focusing on the process. That should be our new focus. Looking at how the student gets to that. We can still look at the outcome, but then we can be critical of it, knowing that we've looked at the process of how we got to that. And rather than, relying on, AI detector engines, which frankly aren't particularly reliable, let's be open about how we're using it, as I said before, and let's focus instead on that process. And then we can look at the outcome in relation to that. And we're being open, we know where it's come from, we know what's being done, we can see all those different stages of it, and nobody is trying to hide anything from anybody. Luckily, I have a relationship with my students with this particular class of early years teachers, that they were open with me and they were able to say, this is what we're doing. We're writing something and then we're putting it in AI to fix it. So I said, well, let's be open about that, rather than you pass it off and say, this is 100% my own work. You can say, this is my own work that's been augmented, that's been improved by AI. So just sort of going back there, I think by trying to do this, we can at least try to invalidate the fraud triangle. We take that pressure off. Yeah, we say, it's not all going to be about that final exam, about that final assessment. We remove the opportunity because we're allowing them the opportunity. We're saying it's not cheating. If you're using AI, be open about it. Show us what you're doing. Show us, show us your processes. Show us your prompts. Show us what you're producing. And then in this case, there's no need for rationalization from the students. So this way we can, very much we can invalidate the fraud triangle, which is what I think we need to be doing, at least in many institutions, and I know definitely in my own institution. That's something we're going to have to edit out of the video again every time I mention something about where I'm working. So I was having to think about it, and because not just having taught English, I was also teaching some business courses, and now I'm teaching on the education program. So I've been trying to think cross-program about it as well, and cross sort of subjects as me searching for the word. Now, one thing I thought we could be doing is I've got 6 sort of steps where you could be looking at, you could take a trustworthy piece of AI, something that you've produced and it's AI. And then you could start with, you could criticize that. So, for example, what a lot of students are doing at the moment, my own students who do struggle with English as a second language, they're using AI to generate their emails. And it means I'm getting emails I can understand for the first time in the last sort of 18 years from very low-level English learners. That, I think, is great. However, quite often the tone is wrong. This might be someone that I've known for a couple of years, and they'll write me a letter, an email that will sort of start, my dearest Dr. Robert, I hope this email finds you well. It gives me great pleasure to tell you that I will, be unable to attend your class on Monday because I have a prior commitment with. So it's that we can criticize that and actually teach them, what's wrong with this? Yeah. Linguistically, it's perfect. It does the job. It tells me everything, but it's giving me the wrong message. So, you can be critical of the output, and then this will help students when they're using AI to produce things for themselves. They can see, okay, this is wrong. This essay format that AI has given me isn't what I should be doing here. It's giving me a comparative essay. It should be argumentative. It should be X, Y, or Z. But they'll have that capacity if we start to train them to look at different examples and actually criticize it. This sort of leads then into comparing it. So giving them different examples, which is better? If you give them 2 or 3 examples and say, right, okay, you need to write to the head of this company and, try to get an introduction for somebody to give a sales pitch. That will be a very different tone to, you need to write to company Z. They haven't paid your account for 6 months. So what should the tone of that message be? Yeah. How, which number email is it? If this is the 3rd email you've sent them, for example, or the 3rd letter, do we still send letters? Probably not. So, looking at those comparisons between different types of text, not just text. I mean, it could be other outputs. I don't know enough about other things, but it could be in art. If you're asking it to create, if using something like DALL-E to create something in the style of a famous artist, does it actually match? If you look at the original, okay, that's then leading us into the sort of evaluation stage. How effective is it? Does it do what we're asking it to do? Another thing, of course, is AI is prone to hallucinations. In other words, it will throw rubbish at you. I don't know if you've ever asked it to give you a literature review, because people who know me in terms of research know that I'm not a fan of the literature review. It's generally the last thing I do. And I would, if ever I do any research with anyone else, I will bend over backwards and do anything for them if they'll write the literature review for me. So one of the first times I saw ChatGPT, I was like, great, let's see what it can give me. And it will give you a very convincing literature review. The problem will be that at least 50% of the references it gives you will be won't exist. Now, I know this is something that's going to change as AI advances, as it improves. And again, I mean, that I think surely it would be a better use of my time if I can get AI to generate a literature review for me that I then go in and verify and evaluate and maybe put into my own style so that it fits into my own articles more seamlessly. I mean, would be, that'd be marvelous, because then I wouldn't have to wade through thousands of articles or beg other people to do it for me. Something else we might like to look at is correcting information within that. I mean, again, you might want to, if you're verifying a literature review, you might then need to correct it. You might ask it to say, if your subject was history, to give you, a script about a famous person or a famous event, and to deliberately make several mistakes in that. You can then get students looking at that to correct it. And this means, learning what's a trustworthy source. Where can I actually find that? I think at the moment, many of our students, and particularly, being the Google generation, they're throwing things in and then they're not checking it, they're not correcting it. I had the unfortunate case recently of a student who submitted something that not only was it AI generated, but they had got an essay mill to write it for them. And because they hadn't checked it in any way whatsoever, they didn't realize that the topic was completely irrelevant to the question. So it's beautifully written, and they'd spent money on someone who just used ChatGPT. So they were caught by an AI detector, even though I don't fully trust them. But they were also caught because it was off topic completely. So giving students, again, these sort of skills to criticize, to compare, to evaluate, to verify, and to correct. This is important. I'm not sure it's something that we're doing, but this is what AI gives us, that opportunity. And then they can use AI and apply their own steps. Now, the last thing I'm mentioning there, I've called performance. Now, this came from an experience I had last semester. I had a very, very low-level group of national diploma students who were studying for a business diploma in sales and marketing. And one of their assessments is they had to perform a sales pitch. And they had to follow these 5 stages of the sales pitch, which was like the opening, the pitch, the objections, and the conclusion, and the moving ahead, something like this. So it had to have these 5 stages in it. Now, these students did not have the language level to be able to do that. And then I remembered from my own experiences when I was working in South America, in Brazil, my Portuguese was okay, but it wasn't brilliant. And I used to go out and try and sell language courses to people. So what I did was I created a presentation and I learned a script in Portuguese. And I practiced it, and I practiced it, and I practiced it. And if you ever have the misfortune to hear me present in Portuguese, my accent's pretty horrible, but you'll think, oh, this guy probably speaks quite well, because listen now, seamlessly he's moving between the slides and dealing with questions. If you then chat to me after the presentation, you'll see that I'm intermediate at best, and that my language isn't actually that good. So I was thinking with my students, why am I making them create a presentation? Why am I making them create a script, a dialogue, when what I'm actually going to grade them on, what I actually want to see them do, is how well do they perform that? And if they were working for me, I wouldn't want them to try and write something themselves. I'd want them to use something that was pre-created, something that was linguistically sound, so then they could concentrate on the performance of it. So something like a presentation, okay, we're looking at the content of it as well, but we're also looking at how well it's performed. And again, this is something we can be using generative AI to do. I've used generative AI all over this presentation. The images, generative AI. Within PowerPoint itself now, you can use the AI editor, and it starts giving you all sorts of fancy ideas for how your slides can look. This is a valid use of AI, I think. So I think, we should be, rather than, expecting our students not to use it and to struggle, we should be encouraging them to use it, but to follow perhaps those first 5 steps. And then you're going to end up with a trustworthy AI outcome. So I'm getting towards the end of it, I think, but this triple approach, I want to keep coming back to it, because it's what I sort of keep drumming away at, and I think it really is important. We need to teach students how to use it. We need to encourage openness and integrity with it. I'm not going to pass this off and say this is 100% mine. I'm going to say, no, I've used AI, as a student, I've used AI in this way. I've fixed things, and here, here's the proof. Here's my drafts, here's my ideas, here's what I've produced at the end. And I think keeping at the center of it at all times is that human-centeredness. You know, anything that as a student, anything that I hand in, it's still got my hand on it. I've looked at it, I've gone through it, it's still my work, and I'm being open about what I've done with it, rather than simply passing something off. And I think similarly as a teacher, if I'm perhaps, you know, if I'm using it to generate comments, if I'm using it to generate feedback, I need to check those comments. I need to check that feedback to make sure that what I'm giving them still has, you know, still has Rob in amongst it, still has the human amongst it. Or I'm just going to be open about it. You know, it may be to say to students, say, look, I haven't got time to read all of your essays. So what I want you to do is use this prompt, put it into generative AI. It will give you feedback. And then that becomes part of your submission. You know, that here's the corrections I made based on that. Okay, and this again will invalidate the fraud triangle, and it keeps the human at the center of it, because we're not going to be saying this is not your work. When you're saying, well, this is your work, you're showing me all the stages of it. Now, what we don't have really are effective and realistic policies at the institutional level, at least. They need to come from both directions. You know, I think we need a certain amount of top-down protection that's going to come from higher up within institutions and governments and nations. But there needs to be a real bottom-up approach with it as well, because students are using it and teachers are using it, and they're very much aware of how it can be used, and will be aware of some of the pitfalls that someone who's sitting in an office just reading the theory about it isn't aware of. So I think any policy that starts to be put together has to take both sides into account. And I know, depending on where you're from, you know, for example, it may be that in some environments it's very, very top down, and you won't be able to get any input at all from the bottom up. In other environments, there may be no top down influence at all. You may be completely able to, completely autonomous to develop your own policies around it, to develop your own approaches and decide what you're going to accept as acceptable with AI. Yeah, I mean, do you have a policy? As I say, my own institution at the moment, this is their approach at the moment is still prohibition. I know that the administration itself is using it to write emails, because I'm getting emails even from people within the administration that I know normally I have this horrible habit as an English teacher, is to judge people's writing as soon as it appears in front of me. I'm getting perfect emails from all around. I know it's being used. Perhaps we need some kind of little disclaimer at the bottom, you know, adapted using AI, you know, some kind of, you know, a little symbol or something that you know that that's been modified, but also that it's then being checked by a human. Some kind of stamp that goes on it that, yeah, okay, you know, I wrote this using AI, but I've checked it. The information is correct, and it's my responsibility because it's coming from my email account at the end of the day. I'm not hiding behind anything. So yeah, just to keep going on about it, it's human-centered. We need the literacy, we need the integrity, we need the ethics. Where next? If anyone's sort of kind of interested in this, I'd really, really recommend you follow a guy called Dr. Feng-Chung Miao, who's very high up in AI in UNESCO. And you can download this little book here. I think it's 48 pages or something. Guidance for Generative AI in Education and Research. It's also available in several different languages, and it's completely free. And it sort of follows that triple approach in the sense it talks about integrity, it talks about ethics, and it talks about the importance of literacy. He talks a lot about frameworks. They talk a lot about frameworks. Sorry, it's not just him. But this I would really recommend. As I say, it's a free download, and I'd hope that if you haven't got it already, go and download it. At the very least, it can give you a start into thinking, right, this is where I need to be as an educator. This is how I need to be thinking about it. And this is perhaps how I need to be influencing my students. Even if your institution isn't interested, even if your management isn't aware and doesn't want to be aware and wants to keep their head in the sand, this is a very good starting place for the individual. So, you know, AI brings a lot of benefits, but it needs what a lot of people refer to as ethical guardrails. So if you think a guardrail, like if you're, driving down the M1, the guardrails are there. They're not in front of you. They're not something to stop you. There's something to keep you on the road. There's something to keep you safe. So those guardrails are to stop you running into the dangers, to stop you driving off the road. So we've got lots of opportunities with AI. We can really start to be innovative in our teaching and learning. We can promote inclusivity and lifelong learning because if it's available for everyone. It can be a big aid for education management. As I mentioned with the comment writing, it can also be with, sort of general with AI, with email writing, etc. In combination with things like, mail merge, it can be a real time saver. You can use it for intelligent tutoring because you can be adapting your materials to fit different levels of students. Again, keeping your own pedagogical expertise at the center of that. It can be used to complement assessment, as I've mentioned. I think as long as we're open about it and as long as, students are literate in their use and ethical. And I couldn't resist it. It's a real support for language learning. It really does help students when they can see, I know my own students using it even for email communication with me. I'm having much more effective dialogues with them via email than I've ever had before, because they would struggle to truly express themselves, and now they're much better at doing that. I mean, before I might have 4 emails going, Fatima, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. Which assessment are you having a problem with? Are you tired or sick? Because they've always confused these words. Whereas now, I do get an email. Okay, sometimes it is, my dearest esteemed sir, but everyone needs their ego stroking occasionally, so it doesn't matter too much. And again, I can work with them and teach them and say, look, you just need to start with, dear Rob or dear sir, if they want to be more formal. The dangers, personal data infringement. As I mentioned before, as soon as you put something in there, it's theirs. They've got it. So if you're putting any sensitive information out there, who has it? I don't want to be paranoid and start wearing a silver foil hat, but we don't know where this information is going and how it could be used in the end. A lot of people talk about, how it might be leading to bias. And just 2 examples there of bias in recruitment, bias in evaluation. I mean, you read some horror stories about in certain countries, people being turned down in mortgage applications, for example, because of the way AI is reading the data that's put in there. There's also the misinformation. If you know where the AI is drawing its information from, it's very easy for you as a bad actor, perhaps to keep feeding it information. And that information will only serve to increase the biases or to perpetuate them. Of course, we've got deep fakes. Everyone's aware of that. I think even just today I was reading something about it's now becoming law in the UK. You can be prosecuted for creating deep fakes of people. There's copyright issues. One of my daughters is an artist and was telling me now there's a program you can use to protect your own artwork online called Ghost or something like that. And it stops AI from data scrubbing your art. So it can't read any of your art that's on the web and then copy it or reproduce it in the same style. And is AI for all? I mean, it's great if you're an English speaker and in the English language, but how representative is AI with other languages, for example, with Arabic as a close example? How accessible is it for people perhaps in the prison system, for example, or people in developing countries? Does it really exist? Is it really available for everybody? And then, of course, this is even before we mention the really scary stuff like sort of RoboCop and autonomous AI weaponry, which is a major threat, I think, and something that all countries need to be very, very worried about and very scared about. So just to sort of finish off, I think this is something a colleague of mine was very keen on, and I mean I'm sort of keen on the thing on the left, those 3 things. But they were mentioning that, if we could have these four things working in a sort of harmony, we might be getting somewhere. It's, introducing curriculum, AI into the curriculum. So it becomes part of our everyday curriculum. So we're accepting it. We could be then also giving like certification pathways, perhaps, to educators and even to students, like AI 101 as part of a general studies course for undergraduates, teaching you how to use it, teaching you the literacy, teaching you the integrity, and teaching you the ethics of it. Because our own students now don't know it. They just think it's a magic wand. We need guidelines or guardrails, at least, to keep us within things. So at the moment, is it okay if I use it to give feedback to my students? I don't know. There are no guidelines in my institution about that. And then we need policies. And all sort of four of those would feed into each other. And obviously policies are coming out, but I think slowly. I think there's a lot of wait and see. And I think really we need to be starting at the ground level in our own classes and acknowledging it's happening, and then how we sort of move ahead from there. I couldn't resist it as an activity theorist. I had to put in an activity triangle. Now, obviously, this is something great that I will be maybe over the summer in a few quiet moments. I'm going to start thinking about, mapping AI into activity systems. It's a perfect sort of example of how a disruptive tool is, causing lots of contradictions. We need new rules. It's a massive effect on the division of labor. Who now does what? Who are we expecting to do that? We need to inform the community at large and all the related activity systems. And does our object need to change, or our outcome? Because at the moment, I know within my own institution, we're still expecting a very traditional final assessment, essay-based or project submission final assessment that is a pass or fail. And students have access to AI that we are, in theory, prohibiting. And we're trying to, we're creating a fraud triangle, and we're setting students up for failure and dismissal. And I really don't think that's ethical. I don't think it's acceptable, and we need to do something about it. So that's all I have to say for now. I'll say thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions.
I'll see for that. Thanks, Rob. If anyone has got questions, feel free to type them into the chat function if you want to, or feel free to raise a digital hand. If you raise a physical hand, then just make sure your camera is on so that we can see you. There was a little point I was going to ask your opinion about while people are thinking of any questions there, Rob. One of the common observations is that the hype and hysteria about AI, that's going to change absolutely everything, or that's going to change nothing. The claims are often made kind of devoid of context. And you were very careful there to set out, that you're in languages, you're in the Middle East, you're in a certain setting and sector and all that kind of stuff. How much of that is actually done when you're reading, wider, and when you're engaging with other people? Are people always as careful to set out the particular setting that they're in, or do they just, claim generalizability, I suppose?
I think really is 50-50. It's a bit of both. I've spoken with some people in different fields, and, they're very, very, very clear that, this is my setting, this is what works here. For example, a colleague's daughter is studying in Toronto University. She's studying programming, and they're encouraged to use it.
Yeah.
And it's totally open, and it's out there, but that's very much a sort of isolated case that I've come across. So I think, because perhaps more recently as well, most of my interactions have been with other people in the MENA region, for example, in conferences in Kuwait or here in the UAE. And generally there it's very contextualized, and their experiences are very similar to mine in what they're fronting with it. This is why I'd be very interested to hear how people across the world are finding it.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. You did have a question from, just before we get to Brett, there was a question from Nash who's asking, I think you mentioned a book by someone with a Chinese name, which you didn't quite catch fast enough. Was that the guidance for generative AI that Claire's just put into the...
Yeah, absolutely. That's the link to it. Yeah.
Great
As I
stuff.
say, I really would recommend that you download that. It's a very easy read. There's lots of sort of frameworks and ideas, you know, and somewhere it's a really good starting point. Even if your institution isn't interested, I think it's just somewhere where you can start as an individual. I know it's something I am dipping into a lot.
Yeah, I see a lot of sort of institutions and collections of institutions. Simon very kindly put in the Russell Group sort of guidance earlier. And I think a lot of people are kind of talking about guidance and guide rails and things like that, aren't they, rather than policy.
Yeah,
Brett's going to ask a question, so I'll mute myself. Thanks again, Rob. Brilliant.
no problem.
Thanks, Rob. It's a really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. You put an activity theory triangle at the end. I should warn you that one of my current PhD students is writing an AI in using the activity theory triangle, so we'll see who gets there first. I had a number of thoughts on this. I've probably got at least two questions. Maybe I'll ask one and then come back later if nobody else has got a question. So the first one is, you made this point, which I think is a very good one, about being reflective and externalizing what you've done with AI. I think that's a really important point because maybe it highlights something that we should have been thinking about before even AI. There's always this temptation to think that the world was kind of trundling along with no real change, and then AI has come along as the only major qualitative shift in writing in kind of recent memory. And I'm not sure that's true. So obviously people will go back, many people know this, but the ancient Greeks were very against writing at all because they felt it changed the cognition around the notion of having to remember what you were talking about. But I think an even more recent one is, I don't think that writing in a word processor program like Word is the same skill as writing down an essay with a pen. I think the notion of moving paragraphs around is not really, in the end, a merely quantitative efficiency-based change. I think it's a really major thing. But we don't recognize that. And I think we're particularly bad in the social sciences at not recognizing things like that, because I've had collaborators before in fields, say, for example, in biology. Okay, so I had a collaborator who was doing DNA analysis of these particular plants. And in their papers, they were very explicit about what technology they'd used, who manufactured it in what year, how they put it in at the steps, because for a number of reasons, you might get different results with different technology. Maybe that technology is retrospectively viewed as flawed. Maybe that technology has various tolerances, others wouldn't. It becomes a crucial part of the knowledge construction process. And I think AI is kind of just like that. It's a kind of tool. We should have been talking about other things in the research process like that before, maybe. And what AI is forcing us to realize is we've got to do it now, but maybe it's not just for AI. So reflecting on the fact that you use ChatGPT at these stages of your process for these purposes is a very good practice, but it's good practice academically, isn't it? It's not just a tolerance and coping mechanism for AI, was kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you. I mean, I had a discussion with a colleague recently who was really up in arms because I'd accepted some work from students that they'd shown me their draft and then they'd shown me what they'd done to it. And I was accepting the second draft. And that particular colleague was really up in arms. And I said, well, how different is that to when you write a journal article and you might get help with editing it? You know, there are many, you know, particularly if you're not a first language speaker. You know, I've helped colleagues out a lot with that, you know, in terms of, you know, style and, you know, fixing small linguistic problems within something. And then they don't necessarily mention that when they submit a journal article, for example. But how different is it, really? I think it's more that if we reflect on it and we're open about it, you know, in what we've done, then I think it becomes acceptable, as you said. I think these are skills we should be reflecting on, definitely.
Yeah, good shout. Simon's got a question. This will be good.
I have, yeah. This goes back to something you said very early on, Rob, around this idea of AI acting like a human, I guess, and you touched a little bit on giving feedback and reporting, giving reports on pupils. My wife's a primary school teacher, and I know from her experience that she has statements that she uses across a number of reports. So the extent to which humans are personalizing feedback is questionable. So the question comes here is the extent to which AI could potentially be better at personalizing feedback than perhaps a human, and the extent to which, and I think this is the important question, we should be upfront about that. And how do we reorientate learners to accept that there will be a mix of human-based feedback and artificially generated feedback?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I mean, yeah, I'd take your point. My wife is also a primary school teacher, and yeah, there are sort of sets of common statements that will be used across. I think it's a case of kind of educating, if it's in primary school, you know, the parents themselves, you know, saying that, you know, that the comments may be AI generated, but they're human centered in the sense that I originally wrote a comment that has then been rewritten by AI, if you see what I mean. Would that then be acceptable to people? You know, because I think it still needs that, you know, that it's like, okay, I'm going to generate 10 different comments that essentially say the same thing. But the important thing is that I check those comments so that I make sure that what's going out is acceptable. And then, you know, I can say, okay, these, you know, this list of 10 comments, I only wrote the first one. The other 9 are rewrites, but I've checked them and I accept that it's ethical. There's nothing dangerous within that. There's nothing that's going to cause offense, for example, or nothing that's incorrect. And then use it. Yeah, I mean, it's a massive time saver. I think anyone who's ever been involved in report writing very much has a tendency to do that. You know, there's your excellent comment, your very good comment, your good comment, and your could do better comment, and varieties of the same that go out. So it is a case, I think, of educating the wider community about that and accepting that, you know, this might be better. As you said, you may be getting more personal feedback than you would have been getting before.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? There's a lot of concerns about model collapse. With you know, some commentators saying 2022 will be the last year we remember where, you know, at least the higher functioning large language models were actually being fed by human input. After that year, they're being fed by other large language models, I suppose. But there's sometimes this compelling image of that mythical creature. I think it's Orubos, the snake eating its own tail kind of thing. You see that quite a lot. Whereas, you know, as certain communities of human beings have been doing that for ages, haven't they? Just saying, well, let's look at last year's feedback and change the names.
Yeah.
We didn't call that model collapse. We called it something else, just like we called our, you know, our propensity to make mistakes. We didn't call them hallucinations. And, you know, if somebody was just simply inventing references, we called it what it was. We didn't give it this fancy name of hallucination.
I think it also comes down to something that we were discussing out before we actually came online here about, you know, we were complaining about workload. Now, that is, you know, this is part of the reason. Why last semester I did this? I got comments and rewrote them using ChatGPT and used mail merge to stick them into the reports that emailed the students. Why did I do that? It was because I had 60 to do in an afternoon. And there's absolutely no way I could have written individual comments for each of those students. So the issue there is workload. You know, it's outside of the fact where, you know, is it right for me? You know, were those comments really personal? Was that ethical of me to do? The fact was I had to get it done and I got it done. And, you know, the way I would have done it before would have been, yeah, just, you know, perhaps changing the names from last year's reports. It's, yeah.
Yeah. So we'll go back to Simon and then we'll go back to Brett to the question, if that's okay.
Yeah, so this is absolutely linked. So if you look at the NSS, in every higher education institution in the UK, assessment and feedback is kind of the biggest issue that as the challenges addresses, and feedback particularly, and timely feedback is a challenging human endeavor, let's say, because that good feedback takes a lot of time. And if there's one thing academics don't have, it's a lot of time to do good quality feedback in a short amount of time. So you can already see where the tech-centric's already developing products that will be able to automate a feedback mechanism whenever a student wants it. So as long as the student's essays and data is all in the space, AI will be able to analyze it and give good feedback. So I suppose the question then is the extent to which we as a group here perhaps would be happy to move towards that, because that seems quite student friendly for a student at a formative level at least to be able to use AI to generate feedback at any point in their journey. And the extent to which we would be comfortable with that as a scenario in terms of us in kind of an academic position.
Yeah, it's I think again it's going to come down to the sort of education of it, you know, in educating people about it in that sense. You know, I think, you know, I would perhaps, I'm just thinking back to my experience with the PhD. You know, it's, if you're getting module feedback, that I probably want, you know, it to come from my tutor for that module, for example, you know, and that's what I'm spending money for. But if I could learn how to get feedback on my writing before that process, yeah, I mean, that would be a very effective use of AI, I think. But you need to train people how to do that. And then we need to be sure that that feedback is actually going to be reliable, because if I've had 3 pieces of AI feedback that said, you know, this module I've written for my, for module 3 of the TEL PhD is fantastic, and then Brett gets to it and pulls it to pieces, that could be problematic in itself. So, you know, these are issues I think we're going to have to confront.
That's a lovely segue. We'll take Brett's question, and that's probably going to be a good point to tie a little bow around it all.
It's not quite my original question, although I still have that, but just based on what you've said, I mean, you've said you're an activity theorist, but for those who don't know, the activity theory view of how tools are created involves broad things in the world being gradually separated and divided into smaller and smaller chunks until we get to what are called human operations, and then tools are created that can do human operations. And I think AI might have, you know, possibly been, or, you know, created from this skill set of people being allocated to do smaller and smaller and more mechanical writing tasks, perhaps indeed via things like Amazon's Mechanical Turk and other things like that, where you can probably study quite closely what people do on extremely granular tasks. And when you were talking a minute ago about, well, I pay my, you know, I really want this feedback to be directly from the module tutor, or in another sense, it would be a famous professor in the field or something. I think increasingly the university system is already moving away from that and kind of chunking things into smaller bits by employing, you know, people on little teaching contracts. You know, there have been instances in the UK where there was a big professor giving lectures and then somebody else was doing the feedback. It turned out this professor had been dead for 3 years, you know, this kind of thing, right? So increasingly, you know, a lot of higher education, even if it's not using AI, commits a similar sort of ostensible fraud, right? I mean, we don't at Lancaster, with the module commoner marks the stuff, but it's becoming increasingly interchangeable and granular in just the way that invites a new tool to be created. So it's not a particularly qualitative shift, more a kind of gradual progression. So my original query was about the education about AI, which you have also just talked about in response to Simon's question. There was an occasional use in your talk of words like verify. So, you know, you might verify what ChatGPT generated for you and whether that's actually relevant to the question that was being asked by the teacher. And it strikes me that that's the kind of thing that might even get better over time. But that's a kind of lower level skill that a student might have at education using AI. And it reminds me of the kind of things we faced several years ago with Wikipedia, for example. You know, you're just copying and pasting from Wikipedia, It seems broadly similar to what you might copy and paste from ChatGPT. And at that point, Wikipedia had this awful reputation for being, inaccurate or full of nonsense that people have just put up there. And I think it's a similar sort of phenomenon. And there is a temptation to oversteer. Like my son in his school, they kind of drum into them, perhaps too much in my view. My son, if he sees me on Wikipedia, he thinks I've done something really wrong because Wikipedia is totally banned, Whereas I think Wikipedia is a lot of the time quite a useful tool.
Yeah.
But it's also a case of knowing what it isn't good at. So I think AI might get better at that. Now, what it won't be good at is, let's imagine a literature review, your favorite section. It might be good at producing an accurate summary of what a set of work says, but it won't be good at kind of highlighting how that attaches to the research questions of your paper and how your paper addresses a shortcoming of the literature, and therefore what kind of critiques of the literature you need to make in order to highlight that shortcoming. All of that kind of narrative thread, I can't see, unless you can somehow tell the AI what argument you want to make, which you could, but you're supposed to do that from the literature review, so you'd end up in another infinite regress again. Unless you can do that, I don't see how AI is going to replace the fact of you deciding what kind of argument you want to make. So there's a difference between verifying that something's accurate and kind of localizing and adapting it to the specific intention that you have in writing the piece. And if I had to differentiate, what kind of education do we want when dealing with AI? That's the kind of difference. That's the human thing, is intentionality, isn't it? That's what, again, activity theory would say. Tools don't have intentionality, and people do. That's why their what's the word? Their agency is not symmetrical in an activity theory sense. So I don't know what you think about that, but to me, it's almost like maintaining the specificity of human agency by encouraging people to focus on it and educating them about it. And maybe it's okay to offload some other stuff that's not, in the end, a uniquely human task.
Yeah, no, I think you put that very well. I would agree with that. I think, with that example of the literature review, I mean, if AI, yes, could be, I think will become very good at, summarizing the articles, or, drawing together, a body of work and putting it into something that's manageable. But then, as you say, I think, the human then needs to step in and put their stamp on it, which is, how does it relate to the research that you're doing? How does it, I mean, you'll know yourself just from, when you collaborate on a paper with someone. Sometimes that can be the hardest part of it, is keeping that sort of, I think you call it the narrative thread going through it, because, like I may be sort of heading off that way and you may be heading off that way, but we don't realize it because we're not in each other's heads. So that's part of a dialogue that we then have to have, and that's where the editing process comes in, and and looking at it as a human. And yeah, I agree. I think AI could take a lot of the donkey work out of things. It's basically, which is the the summarizing of all these articles, but it can't do the interesting human part of it, which is then which is then linking those articles, which is relating it, which incidentally is the part I don't mind about a literature review. It's the plodding through to that part that I find a struggle. So if AI can help me out with that, then I'm more than happy. But again, it does come down to the education of it. So it's teaching our students that, okay, AI will do all of this for you. It's a massive time saver, but then this is where you come in. This is where you put your stamp on it. This is where the human sits on top of it, and it becomes your piece of work rather than something that's machine generated. So
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Brett. Great point.
Yeah, that was super, that. We'll start tying a little bow around it all now. And thanks very much for coming along. I think it's fair to say it's easier to present some friendly faces, and we will get a lot more follow-up afterwards. So please do keep things going. Remember to follow us on YouTube and subscribe for updates. That's where the recording will ultimately appear when Rob's had a chance to help me edit some bits out that I want removing, I'm sure. And if you've got any ideas for further show and tell sessions, and if you've got any ideas for presenters you'd like, please do drop us a line. if you could just join me in a customary fashion digitally or physically to thank Rob for his time and effort. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone as well for the links in the chat. Some interesting resources there I'm going to check out. So thanks for that.
Yeah, super. And if you could just hang around for a couple of minutes, Rob, and
Sure.
on just for a quick chat, won't take long. Thanks very much, everyone. We'll see you again for show and tell and other events. Cheerio.